You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. As we approach the anniversary of our first year of our new crime show here on WGCH, we want to first off thank our listeners. And secondly, we put together with our producer, John Iannuzzi, the best of Forensic Talk 2017. We picked two cases that have had national exposure for years and originated right here in Greenwich. First off, the Moxley murder and the Skakel appeals. We have become the broadcast source on the case. And in our first segment, we will have Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Bobby Kennedy Jr., claims Michael Skakel was framed and names who he believes are the real killers. You'll hear him in the first segment get a real grilling from us. Second segment, Mickey Sherman was Michael Skakel's lawyer. He was deemed incompetent by the courts. This conviction was overturned on appeals. That has been reversed. You'll hear the palpable sense of relief and Mickey Sherman able to speak out again for the first time. And then finally, the tragic case of the Honeymoon cruise death. George Smith IV, Greenwich resident, longtime four-generation family here in town, went overboard mysteriously. The family, Breen Smith, his sister, Maureen Smith, his mother, join us, and they go through the case that both these cases we're going to stick with until we get final resolution. A murder that's captivated a nation over 40 years. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. puts his reputation on the line for his cousin, Michael Skakel, proclaiming his innocence, charging he was framed, claiming he can ID the real killers. The Martha Moxley murder. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a New York Times best-selling author, one of the nation's leading environmental analysts, activists. He's president of the Waterkeeper Alliance, the world's largest clean water advocacy group, a professor of environmental litigation at Pace University here in White Plains, senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, former assistant DA in Manhattan, of course, a member of America's most prominent political family. He's got a controversial book that's just out, Framed, Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder he didn't commit. Thanks, Bobby, and thanks for being in studio with us, too.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
By the way, just to remind folks, Martha Moxley was murdered in 1975 on Halloween Eve. Michael Skakel was convicted of that. He served 11 and a half years before a habeas corpus appeal let him out for incompetent legal representation by Mickey Sherman, also a Greenwich resident. Let me ask you first, because this is what folks have asked me, prominent family, leading environmentalist, why are you risking your reputation? Why are you doing this?
Well, I wrote the book because the same reason that I wrote the article, my Atlantic Monthly article in 2003, because I knew Michael Skakel was innocent. Oddly, my relationship with Michael Skakel over the past, since 2003, since before I wrote that article, has been largely estranged. In fact, I didn't reconcile with him until January of this year. But I knew he was innocent, and I watched the whole trial happen, and it was like watching a slow motion train wreck. And I saw. I didn't know about the corruption that I found while investigating this book. I didn't know about a lot of the details, but I could tell. I knew from watching it that he was being railroaded.
Okay, Bobby. The title is Framed, and ironically, Michael was never a suspect until he put himself at the scene of the crime in the Sutton Report, which, for those that don't know, was a private investigation group hired by Michael's father to look into this thing, to hopefully exonerate them.
Yeah, Michael is, that's right. But he was telling the truth. Michael doesn't have a good filter. He's not a strategic thinker. Whatever comes into his head, he talks about. And he was by the time the Sutton Report came out, he'd been sober for a decade. He had, he's scrupulously honest. And when they asked him what had really happened that night, he gave a different story than he'd told police in 1975. But it was not a new story. He'd been telling that story ever since he got sober in 1982.
Now, I got to commend you on this. First of all, obviously great loyalty. The book is incredibly detailed. And so for my looking at this, I said, well, I'm going to go look at some of the stuff that you used and that's out there, the Sutton Report, which we just talked about what that is, the Furman book. I looked at Martha's diary a little bit, the YouTube that you recommended on Tony Bryant. and the Atlantic Monthly article that you wrote, and then obviously framed. First off, on the Atlantic Monthly article, that was obviously focused on Kenneth Littleton, who was the tutor, extensively. In your book here, he has almost a bulletproof alibi with Tommy Skakel. The sexual encounter ended at 9:50 between Martha and Tommy. He then watched the French Connection, either at 10 or 10:17 he arrived. That means that Littleton had that little window to go out, pick up a golf club, and rage kill someone he didn't know because he had just moved in that night. What about the sort of the changes in even your approach?
Well, when I wrote the Atlantic Monthly article in 2003, I was very careful about saying I don't know that Kenny Littleton committed this crime, but I know that the evidence against him was far stronger than any evidence against Michael Skakel. Michael Skakel could not have committed the crime. He was 11 miles away with 5 eyewitnesses when the crime was committed. There were 8 eyewitnesses that remained at home at Belhaven who either saw him leave or saw him leave, saw him come back, and all of them have testified through the years that he was not at the house at that time. Kenny Littleton, on the other hand, had 5 separate alibis. Every time he talked to police, his alibis changed dramatically. He failed lie detector tests on multiple occasions. He was linked by police to 20 other serial killings, mainly of young blonde girls Martha's age, in Canada and the United States, in different places where he'd lived. And he was in and out of prisons and mental hospitals, and he made several statements that appeared to be confessions to the crime. So there was a very strong case against him. I don't believe that Kenny Littleton committed the crime. And I said at the time that I didn't know, because I don't think the evidence was sufficient. I think it pointed to him in many ways, and he was by far the strongest suspect. And he was the primary suspect of the police who were investigating this for 25 years.
I want to talk about that alibi, about going to the background a little bit later. To me, I looked at a framework, too. Could you establish reasonable doubt legally? And I think that's not actually, honestly, very hard to do going beyond Tommy Skakel. And why is it that you don't list him as a logical suspect?
Oh, well, I do in this book.
But he's not anywhere near your killer, in terms of priorities and how you list them out.
Each one of the suspects I devote a chapter to, and Tommy has the longest chapter. Tommy Skakel didn't commit this crime. His alibi is I would say it's ironclad. It's not. Michael's is the strongest alibi, but Jonathan Benedict, who's the prosecutor in this case, and Detective Frank Garr, who had a great antipathy, hates the Skakels, and spent a lot of his career trying to link the Skakels to this crime. But even he says that Tommy Skakel could not possibly have committed this crime. And the reason he gives is the same reason that you described for Kenny Littleton, that he's a 17-year-old kid. He would have had to murder Martha. The murder took place at 10 o'clock at night. And Tommy, 20 minutes later, was watching the French Connection.
He also has no motive.
He has no motive, exactly. But, whoever committed this crime was covered with blood. He was wearing the same clothes that he wore at dinner.
Well, let me ask you, on the Sutton report, they identify a profile of the killer. That profile fits Michael the best, 14 to 18, walking distance of the victim, same socioeconomic, strong sibling rivalries, behavioral problems in school, sexually immature, which you say in the book, by the way, under the influence of alcohol. And they describe Michael as severely agitated, possibly of psychotic proportions. He had a very abusive background. I happen to, Tommy Reynolds is great friends with my parents. Ann Reynolds Skakel was the mother. When she died, the family basically fell apart. I feel bad for Michael in that sense. But the Sutton report, basically, profile and fit, he's the best fit from there.
Well, There's a number of problems with that theory. One is that Michael couldn't have committed the crime because he was 11 miles away with all the eyewitnesses. The prosecutor, nobody's ever been able to explain how he could have committed this crime from 11 miles away.
If he went to the backcountry.
If he went to the backcountry, and if he didn't go to the backcountry, then why did nobody see him the entire night?
Well, hypothetically, Bob,
you would have had you need 15 people essentially to be lying to say that he didn't go to the backcountry, including people who have no relationship to the Skakel family. The other thing is that the Sutton report is not reliable because, as I show in the book, and this is one of the things we discovered in writing the book, is that Tommy Sheridan, who was an insider in the Skakel family, who dreamed up the Sutton report, then subtly manipulated the contents of the Sutton report to implicate Michael. So it was the whole exercise of the Sutton report was deliberately orchestrated in order to falsely implicate Michael.
Okay, Bobby. I did watch, per your recommendation, the book that Vito Colucci interrogating Tony Bryan. He comes off looking very articulate and sincere, but no one saw these two guys that night. Helen Nix didn't see him. He says in the tape that Margie Walker, who was, I guess, Neil Walker's sister who lived next door, saw him, that he talked to them. She didn't even go out that night. Another person named Lisa Rada Edwards said she didn't go out that night. And so, and I've been in Belhaven, as I was telling you, these folks, like black folk, would have really stuck out back then. The security guards on the booth actually come to recognize you. Used to drop my daughter every day. They would wave. No one saw the guy. And in the 2007 attempt at the retrial, why has it never been considered credible enough to be entered as evidence anywhere?
Well, here's the answer. Those are two questions. The first question is that the question of whether they were there that night. And, the best evidence that they were is that Tony Bryant, who is also African-American, says he was there. And it's definitely not in his interest to admit that he was there. Both of the men, Adolph and Burr, both acknowledged on tape that they were there that night. And that they were there many times in the past. People's memories 30 years later are incomplete. You said that Margie Walker says she wasn't out that night, but Burton and Tinsley and Tony said that they dropped by her house and that she wasn't out that night.
Right, but wouldn't she have said she saw them then?
Well, if she remembered, but the memories of that night are incomplete, and everybody says, well, a black person in Greenwich would have been noticed, but there was a lot of black people in Greenwich that time. People's memory of Belhaven as being lily white just isn't accurate. There were the Skakels, for example, had two African-American teenagers living in their home at that time that were, precisely the age of all these other kids. They had a black live-in housekeeper. There are many other people in Greenwich who had people who were working for them, live-in people who were African-American. The two officers who first arrived on the site were both African-American. So they're, the memories that people have, there couldn't have been a black. Tony Bryant was a frequent visitor to Greenwich. He had a girlfriend in Belhaven. And again, people don't remember that these days. So the memories are of virtually every witness that I was able to interview.
The second question now, just to get going, which was that it hasn't been considered credible.
Well, this case has never been vetted by a jury. It's never, the police never questioned these witnesses. One of the suspects, Adolph Hasbrook, home is only a few blocks from Frank Garr's office in Bridgeport, and yet Frank Garr has never bothered to go down and interview Adolph Hasbrook. Now, what the state will say now is, well, they've taken the fifth, they refuse to talk to us, but the state has it in its power to give them immunity and force them to talk. So, and Tony Bryant has indicated that that's what he wants to do. He wants to tell the state the truth about this crime, but they won't give him immunity first, which of course they ought to. So the state, and if the state really believed that Michael Skakel was guilty, And why wouldn't they give immunity to these
if they
three
give
men?
it, yeah, but if they do, you're right in that sense. But if they give them immunity and they're the real murderers, they're off.
Right, but if they, so, and I think that the state recognized that, and that's why they don't want to give them immunity.
All right, let's go back to some of these evidence, because to me, a huge, crucial moment is, did Michael go to the backcountry? Because that gives him an alibi. And there is evidence that he did not. And one of the things that's interesting is Julie Skakel in 1975, which is when this happened. You talk about memory problems. She sees that shadow at 9:30 that you talk about, and then she yells, "Michael, come back here." Finally in the actual trial, as you say, she said she saw at 9:50 then large, dark, bigger figures than her brother running, carrying an object in their left hand. In 75, she said in 1975, she said at 9:50 she saw nothing. Did she change her testimony, or what are you basing that on, the confidence of Julie? Who, and by the way, interestingly enough, Andrea Shakespeare, you say that she cited, and she very strongly that Michael didn't win, and you go after her, but you never mentioned Julie had at one time said he didn't go.
I have never read anywhere that Julie said that he didn't go. Andrea Shakespeare says, and Julie says, what Julie has said consistently is she was in the house, that they never saw the Lincoln leave with the boys in it. Andrea Shakespeare never saw the Lincoln leave with the boys in it.
So they didn't know if Michael was in the car?
They were essentially in a dead zone in that house. And Andrea Shakespeare, if you read her testimony, she said Michael was never a suspect in this case, so nobody ever asked her about Michael Skakel until 10 or 15 years after the crime was committed. And she said at that time that she never saw Michael Skakel in the house, but that she had a feeling he was there. But she also said she had a feeling about a bunch of other things. For example, that Jeffrey Byrne wasn't there, that were also inaccurate. And, a hunch by a witness 15 years after the crime was committed is not very reliable evidence. And that's the only evidence. And in terms of, Julie saw a figure just before she left the house, Julie and Andrea, dashing in front of the window. It was in a crouched position. She didn't know who it was or whether it was one of her brothers, and she shouted out Michael's name, but she never saw him, and she does not believe that was Michael Skakel.
All right, let me give you one chance to. Mrs. Moxley never gets closure on this case, and she's reading the book, I'm told, and she's heard about the Crawford Mills thing. He's the guy that you'd said first reported this to you. He ended up committing suicide. She had confronted him on he was working at ABC, I think. What about Mrs. Moxley on that?
Well, on the larger issues, I'm trying to give Mrs. Moxley and the Moxley family closure on this case. By putting the real killers in jail, I sympathize and empathize with Ms. Moxley. I've had 2 members of my family murdered. And I know the difficulty of you losing people, young people. I have 2 brothers who died at a very young age, before their time or before they reached their potential. So I have great sympathy for her, but it doesn't give closure to the Moxley family by putting an innocent man in jail for the murder of their daughter. It only compounds the tragedy. And I think, ultimately all of us have a duty to look for the truth. And, and there's no justification for putting somebody who's innocent in jail. Mrs. Moxley has repeatedly said that she does not want to look at the evidence of this case. So her opinions about who is guilty and, Michael's guilt come from Mark Furman, which she acknowledges, Detective Garr, Dominic Dunn, and Len Levitt. And those are all people with craven and mercenary agendas who, I think did not do. I think they did a great disservice to Mrs. Moxley, although they all claim to have her interests at heart. I think all of them were pursuing their own interests, and I think I show that clearly in this book.
We'll be right back with Mickey Sherman, whose defense of the Skakel murder trial has just been vindicated by the Connecticut Supreme Court. Happy holidays from Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. From Philly to Fresno, Brooklyn to Boston, Data Cable Superstars has the best prices on installation of Cat 5 and Cat 6 wiring for cameras, computers, phone, and data, specializing in off-peak installs as to not interrupt your workflow. If this is an I need it done yesterday situation, then it's time to call Data Cable Superstars at 203-942-1427 or go to datacablesuperstars.com. That's Data Cable Superstars, all one word, .com. Data Cable Superstars, where estimates and big ideas are always free.
Robert Reese with the CEO Show Minute here with Jim McCann, CEO and founder of 1-800-Flowers. You're known for great customer service. Give me an example.
We have stories about extraordinary delivery situations where a fellow in an airport, he decided, his girlfriend gave him an ultimatum and said, if you don't propose to me by the time I leave for Paris with my family on vacation, don't call me again. Well, at the last minute, he decided this was a good thing and he shouldn't miss out on it. And he asked if we could engineer delivery to Kennedy Airport on Long Island to get these flowers with a proposal to his girlfriend to say that, in fact, he did want to marry her. So we had a delivery guy make a special arrangements with the Port Authority police to get right to the gate with the bouquet, and he knelt down and he read the card message to her while her mom and dad and her sister stood there, and he read the proposal to her, and he had a cell phone in his hand saying, if the answer is yes, I'm instructed to call Richard and put you on the phone with him. So we have photographs of that situation. It was covered by the local TV station because they got wind of what was going on, and it was a great story.
Thanks, Jim. Robert Reese on the CEO Show Minute.
All right, in our next segment, we've got Mickey Sherman, a Greenwich lawyer, Michael Skakel's lawyer. He was deemed incompetent, conviction thrown out, reversed on appeal. You'll hear Mickey Sherman freed to speak out again next. Mickey Sherman, both nationally renowned and locally acclaimed here in his hometown of Greenwich. He was the lead defense attorney in Kennedy cousin Michael Skakel's trial for the 1975 murder of Martha Moxley when both Skakel and Martha, the victim, were 15 years old. Mickey's known as a celebrity defense attorney. He's been a legal analyst for CBS, frequent guest on all the major networks, and many appearances on Nancy Grace's show when it was on. He was on with us before on his book, How Can You Defend These People? And I understand he has a new one in his works where we will discuss later. Welcome back, Mickey.
Good to
have you. To me, this was a huge case of judicial overreach. And it reminded me of, I don't know if you remember this, but in the Ford administration, Ray Donovan was the Secretary of Labor.
When Ray Donovan came out of the courthouse, they said, blank, 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 and he's looked at them and said, that's all well and good, but just tell me who I see about getting my reputation back.
Yeah,
did I get it right?
You got it 100% right.
Yeah,
took it right out of my mouth, and I thought about you on this.
That speaks volumes.
So you can kind of relate to that now.
Totally.
How tough was it for you not to be able to talk during this whole period? I remember asking you if I could interview, and you said, no, I'm laying low, no interviews, and I said I'd never seen Mickey Sherman and not speaking in the same sentence.
I've been taking that position for 15 years. I didn't speak about the case until starting after the day of the verdict on June 7th, 2002. So I just started commenting 3 days ago when this decision came out because I think it was appropriate, and it is appropriate for me to comment on that.
Did the closeness of the vote, 4-3, surprise you? Did the decision surprise you?
Everything surprised me. I just didn't believe that they would overturn another judge's ruling.
Bittersweet aspect, though, about Michael's status?
It's not even bittersweet. It would be bittersweet if I was enjoying the fact that this is all happening. I'm gratified and I'm thankful to the public and the lawyers and everyone in town and elsewhere who've been very kind to me and said, good job, you've been vindicated. But it's not a vindication. I still lost the case. Yeah. I mean, people don't understand that in the criminal law world, you don't get credit for trying hard. You don't get credit for doing a good job. You don't get credit for having a great attitude. You get credit only when you win.
Bill Parcells used to say that. No medals for trying.
That's it. That's the litmus test. And if you did a great job, it doesn't mean anything. So I totally get the fact that people, certainly the Skakels, were upset that Michael went to jail. And the problem is now that even though I've been, as they say, vindicated, that doesn't move the ball any further to Michael getting out of jail or staying out of jail. And that's a very, not bittersweet, just bitter.
The habeas decision in itself seemed like a small chance that it could happen. Does he have any pathways left, and should he be back in jail now, having had since the conviction for murder reinstated?
Well, I'm not an appellate lawyer, but I would imagine that they'll move pretty quickly for something called reconsideration, which is basically asking for a do-over. I don't know on what basis they'll use because the case has kind of been litigated ad nauseum. They'll also appeal, I assume, to the United States Supreme Court. But that's always an uphill battle. But again, this was an uphill battle just to get to where they got 3 years ago. So anything is possible in this case.
Under normal circumstances, would the person go right back to jail?
God only knows. I've never had this situation. Technically, on the papers, that's what should happen. But I think he'll make an argument for a higher bond, and we'll see what the judge says.
Do you have, at this stage, a whodunit kind of thing? You continue to maintain, I assume, that Michael was innocent.
Always have, and I always will believe that's the case. Whodunit? I think there's a good chance that his brother may have done it. Do I know that for sure? Absolutely not. Could I prove it? No. And I was criticized widely in the habeas action for not proving that Tom Skakel did it. But I'm not the police. If I had concrete evidence or even tenable evidence, I would have acted on it as best I could.
In fact, we'll talk about that a little bit because one of the I think the big three habeas issues was that you chose not to use Tommy as a third party.
That's correct.
Culpability. The question is first off, it was circumstantial, right? And the evidence against Tommy was in the Sutton report, which is hearsay and privilege, right? Right. So is there any evidence that you really could have put on showing that Tommy did it without violating that?
No, and especially when he told me, when Tommy and his lawyer told me that he would invoke the Fifth Amendment. So he wouldn't even open his mouth on the stand. And the question is, how would the jury react to that? Would they see that Michael is there fronting for his brother? Would they come to the conclusion that Tommy's involved, but he's helping Michael? God only knows. There's just too many.
And it proves the motive of jealousy and rage, potentially.
Yeah,
right?
I always thought that was such bull. I mean, when Judge Kavanowski marshaled the evidence, I mean, I know Judge Kavanowski forever. He's a terrific guy, a wonderful judge. But I was so not outraged. I was so upset that he took the time to what they call marshal the evidence, which is basically give his scoop as to what could have happened. And they went into this whole jealousy thing, which, I mean, 15-year-olds don't kill each other out of jealousy. It just doesn't happen. At least not in Bellhaven, not in Greenwich, not in Chickahominy. It just doesn't happen.
So you use the tutor as a third-party culpability option, let's call it that. And did you think at the time Tommy was the most likely, and then still use Littleton, or you just
didn't know?
You didn't know that.
Okay. Didn't know.
Now, to me, and this, I know that legally it's probably not kosher, but if the Skakels are paying you, and they wouldn't really, to me, view it as a win if you got Michael off and got his brother ending up getting convicted.
I wouldn't have cared.
You wouldn't have cared. So that wouldn't have played into it.
Absolutely not. And they gave me a free rein. Some people have said to me, well, did they tell you you can't do this, you can't do that? No, they always said. So
it's your decision to use it.
Totally. The tutor. It just wasn't effective. With the tutor, Littleton, you had him confessing to the crime on tape to his wife. Yeah. You had the police, the state's attorney's office. You had Frank Garr going to Boston to have the guy's wife tape him saying that he committed the crime. There was not ample evidence, but there was substantial evidence, and that's why I wanted to use him, as opposed to saying, well, it could have been him, and it might have been him, and it might have been him. They criticized me for just staying with one. I was going to ask you
the buffet strategy next.
Exactly.
But on the Garr, and I guess Jack Solomon always thought, the investigator, that it was Littleton. But then it kind of came out that was sort of coerced, that confession, right? Because he was set up.
But he still said some of the things that they couldn't coerce him with. In other words, in his phoned-up confessions, there was bits of information that were not planted there by Garr or by Jack Solomon.
But it was phoned up, kind of. So
some was.
Now, you weren't aware of that, right, at the time?
No, no.
Yeah, so you were kind of set up yourself on that. Let me ask you this on this judicial overreach. I would have thought that applied to attorneys that didn't do anything, maybe fell asleep, maybe were drunk. Am I wrong on that?
Well, that's one of the main cases in attorney incompetence, is there was a guy who was, I think he was charged with murder, and he appealed the case because he lost and claimed that his lawyer slept during the trial at counsel table.
Yeah, that I can relate to. Is incompetence.
But here's the problem: the court in that state overruled the defense, saying your conviction stands because we've examined the record, and the lawyer didn't fall asleep at any of the important parts of the trial.
Okay.
So that's
he got off on that.
Yeah, that's ineffectiveness of counsel.
Yeah, that makes no sense to me. This whole thing. Am I right in this? You could have said after the end of the prosecution case, this is circumstantial. You haven't proved that he was tortured in the land. Those confessions, the people that we impeached, the guys, they were drug addicts. Of these guys, I'm not putting on a defense. And wouldn't that have been a legitimate defense?
No defense.
In other words, you said just what I said. You haven't proved the case. There's no evidence. That
would be the final argument. But you're absolutely right. And someone asked me a couple of days ago, maybe you heard it. I forgot where I said it, but I've said it before. The winning strategy, they asked me what I would do different in this case, what I would do different. And the only thing that I would do different, I would consider exactly what you just said, and that is not putting on a case. Because by the end of the state's case...
I came up with that myself. I'm not a lawyer.
There you go. By the end of the state's case, I was sure we won, as was everyone else in that courtroom.
Yeah.
So I think we lost this case on the testimony of the family. Now, I'm not trying to diss the family, but it just came out crappy. So if I had
it makes the judicial overreach, the Bishop ruling, look even more ridiculous. Because I think you could have justified a no defense strategy, a resting strategy.
Yeah, but who's got the courage, defense lawyer-wise, to do that?
Oh, I agree. I'm just saying that
if I had the, I can't say the word.
I'm really saying that Bishop was off limits with what he did.
Well, the last thing I want to do is saying something negative about Judge Bishop. I wake up screaming in the morning, in the evening, as I sat next to his bench for 4 days.
Right, well, let's go to what you call the buffet table.
Yeah.
Might you, in retrospect, have tried to throw some stuff on the wall, whether it be Tommy Hasbrook, the caveman theory?
No. And the theories that they had, when you're talking about is the two black guys did it.
Yes, Al Hasbrook,
that's essentially what it is. I mean, it's like when somebody buys...
By the way, it's a lynching.
Yeah, no, well, but it's just so bogus, apparently. Then there was a doctor in California, someplace in California, near L.A., who claimed that he knew something about the case and blah, blah, blah. I flew out there, I met with him. He was in John Moxley's high school class, and he claimed to have knowledge that that John was a serial killer. So John killed his sister.
That was in Bobby's book, by the way.
I know that. That's what I'm leading up to. Bobby asked me for all the information about that. I said, are you crazy? I mean, they actually put that in as a possibility. Yeah, meanwhile, the information the guy had, I tracked it down. All the people who were killed, they figured out the people who killed him. Wasn't it? And John Moxley.
Bobby thinks it has maintained Ken Littleton as a serial killer.
Well,
which is also nuts.
Also, after the trial, Bobby wrote a 37-page article in Atlantic Magazine saying that I screwed up because I didn't prove Ken Littleton did it. Right. Then he switched around to make it I screwed up because I didn't prove Halsberg or Tommy. The other theories, which there were so many of them, there was the out-of-control Xerox executives who were combing the...
I didn't hear that one.
Yeah, they were going about their business looking for Mr. Moxley, who was the head of Deloitte Touche, to kill him because they were some business deal they were being unfair about.
So they went after his wife instead. I mean, his daughter.
Yeah. But I mean,
how did you know? Back on the cavemen, the two black guys, Al Hasbrook, that that's now his theory. How did you know that Gaetano Bryant, who was the guy that brought this up and said he saw 12 people in Bellhaven and they went caveman? How do you know that's so bogus?
It just from personal experience. Plus, it was brought forth by Vito Colucci, who was my investigator, and I just didn't trust that.
He was your investigator?
Yeah.
And you didn't trust him?
No.
Interesting. I forgot that it came out of Vito. And so do you think Bobby actually believes that this guy did it? Hasbrook.
It depends on which way the wind is blowing.
Let's talk about Bobby for a second. In his book, the chapter on you, he calls you the clown, a media whore, that you had an incentive to not spend the money because you needed the money, that the family paid you up front. You didn't have a jury expert. You didn't look into the caveman thing. What's your response to all that?
I would do everything I did before. I think it's all bogus. As far as paying me, I charged him by the hours. Only 2 cases I've ever had in my life here, out of 40-some-odd years, I charged by the hour. I think it was $350, which by Greenwich standards is pretty darn low.
Yeah.
And at some point, they just didn't want to pay any more money. So they said, we'll give you a lump sum, and that became a situation where I only had X amount of dollars to work with, and they felt that was unethical. Well, if it wasn't, I didn't create that situation. They did.
But did it cause you not to hire a jury?
No.
Sorry.
And I could have hired jury consultants. I know so many of them from TV and from working. I'm not crazy about them. It's as simple as that. I think it's voodoo. I've used them, but it just wasn't the case for it.
Let me ask you this then. You obviously think Bobby is full of bogus theories, but you believe Michael's innocent.
Yes.
How is that reconciled? Why hasn't Bobby figured out?
Well, I got the case in 1998. The case went to trial and was finished in 2002. Mm-hmm. And I would see Bobby no times. He came once for an hour and a half in those 4 years. He's so concerned about his cousin that he showed up once for an hour and a half.
And he had no strategy suggestions for
you? He had
you?
nothing, except criticism for me later on.
Okay, so what makes you 100% certain that Michael's innocent?
Because
and why does Bobby have to create all this crap to try and make it?
Well, Bobby, I think, feels that if he can create enough dust, it'll whip something up. But that's just not the way it works. I know that Michael's innocent because I know the case. I know the date, the time that the murder was committed, because we proved that using Dr. Jahemchek, who came up from Houston. The dogs barking, we brought in evidence, including even Dorothy Moxley agreed on the time of the death based on the dogs and stuff.
Close to when Tommy finished in the bushes.
9:30 between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. And then we had we knew that Michael was at the Terrian house, but that alibi should have just carried us all the way home.
The fact that he was in the backcountry.
Yeah.
What do you think is the most unfair thing that happened to Michael, either in or out of the courtroom through this whole period?
I think when the media, for example, there was a guy named Greg Coleman who testified. That's the guy that I got to admit that he used heroin.
Well, he was testifying for the grand jury, right?
And he was making and he was making stuff up. Nonetheless, he testified that he was there to guard Michael. He walked into a room. Michael was there, and something like 2 hours went by. Nothing was said. Nothing at all was said, according to this witness. And then finally the witness said, Michael looked at him and said, I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy. And like a total non sequitur. And what's unfair is not that happened, but that it was reported on the front page of the New York Post, just like that. And I think that's a tough headline to erase.
I don't believe Michael ever said that either in reference to that. It doesn't sound like...
It makes no sense.
It makes no sense. Yeah. All right, let's finish off quickly with Bobby. It's a good point. He said all those years he was there once for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Why is he so attached to trying to get Michael off now?
He needs a forum. He needs someplace to make a name for himself.
So it's not necessarily Michael related as it is he's using Michael.
Let me tell you, the one thing that when I represented Michael in those 4 years, there was one thing that Michael told me very often, and that is that there was no love lost between him and Bobby Kennedy. That must have come later, their friendship. But as the run up to the trial, that was the reason that Michael was writing a book, because he was pissed off at Bobby and some of the other relatives, and he was writing a book. And what's the name of the book?
It has the Kennedy name in it.
Yeah. It's like the Kennedy Secrets or something like that. And in the book, he was dissing everybody, including and especially Bobby. Then all of a sudden, Bobby becomes his champion. Yeah.
I asked Bobby, I said, is there any chance that you suddenly fell in love with Michael so that book wouldn't be published? Because it never was. But he said that's not true at all. My own theory is that Michael helped him get off drugs.
Oh, Michael
Bobby,
did?
Yeah. And so
Michael
Bobby feels some sort of...
Yeah. Michael told me many times he did interventions with him.
And I think that may be the source of why Bobby has this thing. I can't explain why he wasn't helping him in court when he could have helped him.
It's too little, too late.
Will this case ever be put to bed?
Not in our lifetime.
Yeah, that's what I think. It's which is kind of a sad thing for the Moxley family, at least.
Yeah. And
maybe even for Michael. But,
totally for Michael.
But It is what it is. Thanks, Mickey. Always great to see you. And
Pleasure.
I guess I'm going to see you on TV next as whoever's playing you. And
If that gets sold, I'll do the circuit and let everybody know.
thank you, sir.
Pleasure.
In our final national segment, the tragic Honeymoon cruise murder case that's got national exposure, we'll have George Smith IV's sister and mother, Maureen and Bree Smith, join us in our final segment. Maureen Smith is George Allen Smith IV's mother. She was born and raised in Hertfordshire, England. Her husband, George Allen Smith III, is from a long-standing Greenwich family. Maureen's become an outspoken advocate for her son and other cruise crime victims as co-founders of the International Cruise Victims Association. And we're joined also in studio with Bree Smith, George Smith IV's sister. And she graduated from Columbia Law School as a Harlan Fiske Stone Scholar, worked as a corporate attorney, and since the disappearance of her brother on Royal Caribbean's Brilliance of the Sea ship, July 5, 2005, while on his honeymoon cruise, Bree's devoted her life to getting justice for her brother and other crime victims of cruises. And in February of 2014, she created a site on Facebook aptly named Justice for George Smith. Welcome back.
Thank you for having us, Jim.
Good to see you both, and thanks for
you.
coming in today. And it makes it more personal for all of us because it's a long-time Greenwich family. And I asked Maureen this last time we spoke a couple of years ago, so I'm going to ask it again. Has it gotten any better day by day? As you get further away, are you able to let go a bit, or is it still just burning in you every day?
It never goes away. It burns you. It eats you up, especially as we haven't had any justice. And we're continually fighting day after day to get justice for my son. And it just never goes away. We're not going to let it go away, not until we get answers for George.
Bree, from your perspective, what's it like to live without closure?
I think it's the worst kind of cruelty there is. Because George was victimized on that night, July 5th, 2005, and our families have been victimized not only by Royal Caribbean, but by a Justice Department that has not gotten justice for my brother.
Are you still a corporate attorney?
No, I'm not.
So you're focused on George
Yes.
as your main mission in life?
Yeah, I blog basically on Facebook to show the truth about what happened to him. It's often obscured in the media, and I make sure that the truth is going to come out about what happened to him.
There's a lot of information you put up there, too.
Yes.
To both of you, is it in your gut? What gives you the sense that it was foul play? Can you almost sense it or feel it? Or
Jennifer Hagel, who's now Jennifer Agnew, her actions from when she first ran from Turkey home to Cromwell, Connecticut, highly, highly suspicious. And it's still suspicious to us, isn't it?
Very.
Yeah, very suspicious.
did you guys? Were you close to her before
were.
and during the
Yes.
wedding?
Yes, we were.
Yeah.
And thought she was a good person fundamentally?
Yes.
My son certainly did as well. He idolized her. I think she was led from the very beginning, from the time that she ran from the cruise ship in Turkey. She went into a hotel. She spent the whole night on the telephone in Turkey. She never called us once. She spent the whole night with her family. She jumped on a plane, came to New York. Her whole family met her, and to drive to their home in Cromwell, they drove right by our house without stopping. So they had many secrets.
How did you find out?
About George?
Yeah.
Mom can actually say she received
We
the call.
received a phone call from John Hagel, Jennifer's father, early hours of the morning, crying. And we wouldn't believe it because we thought he was still around somewhere or missing, but obviously he knew differently.
So basically, we think it was a botched robbery, and because of that, they brutally murdered him, it sounds like, with blood all over the place, and then basically left him on the deck.
I think a lot of people may get thrown over on cruise ships because there's so much crime on cruise ships that gets covered up. And it's mind-blowing that it's been allowed to get along in this country, this civilized country that Americans pay to go on a cruise ship with their American dollars, that those folks in Washington allow this to continue.
Well, let's talk about those folks in Washington. The Cruise Passenger Protection Act has been proposed twice. You can talk briefly about what it does, but tell us why it isn't getting put in place? Is the lobbying of the cruise ships?
Well, it's partially lobbying, but quite frankly, even if this was in place, the Cruise Passenger Protection Act, will it be enforced? Because here we have, George's murder investigation closed twice under former director Jim Comey in 2015 and 2016 with all the evidence, the amount of evidence we alone know about, and the FBI has so much more. And they were even getting more witnesses to come in based on our reward poster, yet they closed down the investigation.
Why did they say they had to close it, or that they had
They said they did not have enough evidence, but we alone have a tremendous amount of evidence.
Well, first of all, the blood evidence is inconsistent with what is been considered to be in the case. So
that, and the fact that our reward, which we first started offering in 2014, was bringing in new witnesses. How do you close a murder investigation when new witnesses are coming forward?
And the $100,000 is put up by your family,
yes,
exclusively.
Yes,
and you have to. Do you have to put that in reserve somewhere, or?
Well, see, it's dependent on arrests and convictions, and unfortunately, the FBI has closed it. But as I said earlier, we're hopeful that under President Trump and the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, that it will be reopened, and we hope to give out this money if people do lead us to arrests and convictions. I think it's a matter of time, Jim, I have to be honest.
How do you, what strategy are you using to get Attorney General Sessions to relook at it?
Well, I'm actually in the process of writing a letter to Acting Director Andrew McCabe, sort of detailing the background of the amount of information we have and the fact that it was closed twice under his predecessor, and requesting him to reopen it, and we're hopeful.
Maureen, you're writing a book?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But did you ever get a title yet, or?
The Ship of Horrors, because that's what they call the Brilliance of the Sea in Naples, Italy, when it pulled into dock.
Really?
The Ship of Horrors. I do know something that Royal Caribbean, when they settle with a family, they will definitely put a silence clause in there, because that was our clause, wasn't it? That we would not be silenced, and I don't think they will ever allow.
Yeah, there's clearly a non-disclosure in hers. Now, originally she had emails to you folks saying, we're going to fight this together.
Right.
And then her whole story switched.
Oh, well, she said that we cannot let them get away with murder. Mm-hmm. And that's a very strange thing to say, because shortly thereafter, she said it was an accident and George's fault. Well, what is it? Is it murder, or is it an accident? It doesn't
When did you
make
think
sense.
it was murder?
I knew right away, because I got the Turkish police statements from the American embassy.
That
and
we
I
shouldn't
knew
have
right
got.
away.
We shouldn't have got those. They were funneled to us by a girl called Laura in the Ankara.
Yeah.
And she wasn't supposed to send them to us.
I was going to say, she's in the U.S. consulate
yes,
there?
but she wasn't supposed to send them. She was new on the job.
And what did the, why was murder was brought up in those?
Well, Jennifer was the suspect. You're not a suspect in an accident, and that says it all.
And she was read her Miranda rights in Turkey, wasn't she?
And she was given a lawyer.
Now, you've read the stuff that they sent you by mistake.
Yes.
Why was she listed as a suspect? Just because she?
That's up to Royal Caribbean.
Yeah, that's up to the Turkish police.
Yeah.
You'd have to ask them.
Yeah.
Fascinating. And I tell you, it's a great memory to your son that you guys have basically devoted your life to this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to. Go ahead, Eddie.
How do you have your son massacred on a cruise ship, left with a bloodstain on an overhang, and not pursue what happened to him? You just can't. I won't let it go.
How is your Mr. Smith dealing with this?
He's fine. He works along with us, doesn't he? We're a united team, and we all have each other. So I think if we were on our own, it would be a lot more difficult. And luckily, financially, we were able to do it, and there's a lot of people that financially can't do it, and they're just thrown to the wayside.
Great tribute to George. Thanks to Maureen Smith, to Bree Smith.
Thanks. You've been listening to the Best of Forensic Talk 2017. Be sure to stay with us as we go into a whole new year of shows coming up. Happy New Year, everybody.